Imagine for a moment that you are being transported to one of the most hostile environments a human being can face. We are not just talking about armed conflicts or military strategies. We are talking about something much more primitive, something that touches the roots of human fear. We are talking about the Vietnamese jungle during the 60s and 70s, an ecosystem where every shadow could hide not just a human adversary, but creatures that evolved over millions of years to become perfect predators, silent hunters, and carriers of dangerous poisons. Between 1964 and 1975, hundreds of thousands of young Americans were sent to a completely strange territory. They came from cities, from farms, from quiet suburbs where the greatest natural danger could be a stray dog or an angry bee. Suddenly, they found themselves immersed in a world where nature itself seemed to have been designed to test the limits of human endurance and sanity. This is not just another documentary about war. This is the untold story of how Vietnam's wildlife has become a silent, ruthless, and often more terrifying enemy than any military confrontation. It is about how poisonous snakes hid in boots, how mosquitoes carried devastating diseases, how tigers lurked in the shadows, and how the environment itself turned into a battlefield where survival required much more than military training. Before we continue this disturbing journey through the jungles of Vietnam, I need you to do something for me. If this content is piquing your curiosity, if you want to find out more about these extraordinary stories that are rarely told, click the sign up button right now. And leave me a comment telling me what time you are watching this video. It helps me tremendously to keep bringing these fascinating narratives to you. Now, let's dive into the heart of the Vietnamese jungle. The Indochina Peninsula, where Vietnam is located, is one of the most biodiverse regions on planet Earth. Dense tropical rainforests, labyrinthine mangroves, fog-covered mountains, and serpentine river deltas create a mosaic of habitats that are home to thousands of animal species. Many of these creatures had never had significant contact with Western humans until the arrival of American troops. Soldiers landing in Vietnam received extensive training on combat tactics, weapons handling, and basic survival. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could adequately prepare them for what they would find in the jungle. The military manuals contained a few pages on dangerous fauna, but the reality surpassed any technical description. Let's start our journey with one of the most feared and misunderstood creatures of the Vietnamese jungle: snakes. Vietnam is home to more than 200 species of snakes, and at least 30 of them have venom considered dangerous to humans. Among these, some stand out not only for the toxicity of their venom, but for their tendency to come into direct contact with soldiers. The Russell viper, known scientifically as Daboia rasselii, was a constant presence in rural areas and on the edges of jungles where many military operations took place. This snake, which can reach 1.5 meters in length, has a pattern of scales in shades of brown and yellow that makes it almost invisible between the dry leaves and the undergrowth. Its venom is hemotoxic, which means it affects the circulatory system and can cause serious complications. Imagine the scene. A platoon is establishing a defensive perimeter at dusk. The men are exhausted after a 10-hour march through rough terrain, while a young soldier, perhaps only 19 or 20, stretches out his tarp to sleep. His hand inadvertently lands next to a Russell viper that was resting under a fallen log. The reflection of the serpent is instantaneous. His fangs will stick into the boy's hand before his brain can process what's going on. In the first few minutes, the pain is intense but manageable. There is an immediate swelling around the bite. But then, as the poison spreads through the bloodstream, more serious symptoms begin to appear. The soldier's blood begins to lose its ability to clot properly. If the dose of poison is high enough and the treatment does not arrive quickly, serious complications can develop. The problem was that often the soldiers were within hours or even days of any proper medical facility. Medical evacuations depended on helicopters, which could not fly in all weather conditions and certainly not overnight in hostile areas. Many Russell viper-stung men needed urgent medical care, while their companions did their best with limited medical supplies. But Russell's viper wasn't the only snake that haunted the soldiers' nights. There was also the band kite, an extremely poisonous nocturnal snake that had a particularly disturbing habit, seeking warmth during the colder hours of the night. For a kite, a sleeping bag occupied by a warm human represented a perfect place to warm up. Veterans tell stories of waking up with something cold gliding over their faces or their bodies. The feeling of noticing that a poisonous snake is sharing its sleeping bag is hard to describe. Some men reacted instinctively, moving sharply and causing a defensive sting. Others were completely paralyzed by fear, barely daring to breathe as the snake eventually slid away. Kite venom is neurotoxic, attacking the nervous system. A sting can cause progressive paralysis, starting with numbness at the bite site and eventually affecting other bodily functions. Unlike the intense pain caused by hemotoxic poisons, kite stings often produced little initial pain. This deceptive feature meant that some soldiers did not immediately realize they had been stung, wasting precious time before seeking help. There were documented reports of men waking up feeling only a slight tingling in one foot or one hand, ignoring the symptom and going back to sleep, only to wake up hours later completely unable to move that limb. The progression could be worrying. As the poison circulated, the paralysis spread. Talking became difficult. Swallowing complicated. Eventually, without medical intervention, the condition worsened significantly. Now, let me take you deeper into the jungle, to the places where vegetation becomes so dense that sunlight barely penetrates the canopy above. Here, another kind of snake waited on the branches of the trees and on the hanging foliage. Ditch vipers, including species such as Trimeresurus albolabris, known as white-lipped vipers, were masters of tree camouflage. These snakes have a vibrant green coloration that makes them practically invisible between the leaves. They have special sensory organs called pits, located between the eyes and the nostrils, which detect infrared radiation. In simple terms, they can literally see the body heat of their prey. For a soldier moving through dense vegetation, cutting vines and pulling away branches, the risk of bringing his face or hand closer to a pit viper waiting patiently on a branch was constant and real. The bites of these tree vipers often occurred on the face, neck, or hands, particularly vulnerable areas. Swelling that followed a sting to the face could pose additional risks. There have been cases where soldiers needed emergency medical interventions in challenging conditions in the middle of the jungle while awaiting evacuation. Veterans described the constant paranoia that developed. Every branch that moved could be the wind, or it could be a snake. Each greenish shade on the foliage could be just a leaf, or it could have eyes and fangs. Sleeping became difficult not only because of the danger of military ambushes, but because the soil, trees, even makeshift shelters themselves could harbor serpents. Some platoons developed elaborate rituals before establishing camp. Designated men meticulously inspected every inch of land, beat trees with long sticks, turned stones and logs. But in a jungle that stretched endlessly in all directions, where it was impossible to inspect every square inch, these rituals offered more psychological comfort than actual protection. And then there were the water snakes. Vietnam has extensive systems of rivers, canals, flooded rice paddies, and mangroves. Many military operations took place in these aquatic or semi-aquatic environments. Marine snakes and freshwater aquatic snakes presented unique dangers. True sea snakes possess some of the most potent poisons of all snakes. Gram for gram, the venom of certain species of sea snakes is more toxic than that of the most poisonous land snakes. Fortunately, these creatures are usually docile and reluctant to bite. Their mouths are small and it is difficult for them to bite something as big as a human. But when they bit, usually because they were accidentally stepped on or grabbed, the results could be devastating. Soldiers conducting patrols in mangrove areas or crossing channels sometimes encountered sea snakes floating on the surface or swimming in shoals. The temptation to simply ignore them was strong, but in murky, fast-moving waters, distinguishing a harmless snake from a potentially lethal one was almost impossible. There were incidents of men coming out of the water, discovering tusk marks on their legs or feet, completely unaware that they had been bitten until symptoms began. Symptoms of marine snake poisoning included painful muscle stiffness, progressive paralysis, and rhabdomyolysis, a condition where muscle tissue breaks down and releases harmful proteins into the bloodstream, potentially causing kidney failure. For a soldier already dealing with dehydration, extreme fatigue, and the physical demands of combat, adding marine snake poisoning to the equation often resulted in a grim prognosis. But we go beyond the snakes for a moment. The Vietnamese jungle had other equally terrifying residents. Among land predators, the Indochina tiger reigned supreme. These magnificent felines, smaller than their Bengali cousins but no less formidable, were inhabitants of the mountain forests and less disturbed areas of the jungle. For most American soldiers, tigers were creatures that existed only in zoos or on television shows. The reality that a 200-pound predator, equipped with claws capable of tearing flesh and bone, actually inhabited the same forests where they patrolled was difficult to process. Survival manuals mention tigers, but almost casually, as if they were just another item on a list of potential hazards. The truth was much more complex. Tigers generally avoid humans. They are nocturnal hunters and extremely cautious. However, the conditions of the war created situations where encounters became inevitable. Military operations disturbed the normal patterns of the jungle. Explosions, shootings, and the constant presence of large groups of humans altered the behavior of local wildlife. Also, tigers injured or too old to hunt their natural prey occasionally developed a taste for easier targets. A human, especially a wounded, exhausted, or sleeping human, represented relatively simple prey for an experienced tiger. There were reports, difficult to verify but persistent among veterans, of tigers following patrols from a distance, watching and waiting. One of the most disturbing aspects of tigers as predators is their ability to move in complete silence through dense vegetation. Such a large animal should make noise, but tigers have evolved to be striped ghosts. They can approach a prey from meters away without producing a single detectable sound. For soldiers already on high alert, constantly alert to enemy ambushes, the idea that a natural predator could also be lurking was deeply destabilizing. There have been documented incidents of tigers invading military perimeters at night. Imagine standing guard on a moonless night, your eyes struggling to distinguish shapes in absolute darkness, each sense sharpened to the slightest hint of movement. Suddenly, there is a low, deep grunt which you feel as much as you hear. Before you can react properly, something huge and powerful is upon you. Tiger attacks were rare, but when they occurred, they were extremely dangerous. Tigers are powerful natural predators, with strength and refined instincts over millions of years. Soldiers trained for human combat found that their skills were almost useless against an apex predator acting out of pure instinct. Perhaps even more disturbing than direct attacks were the near encounters. Veterans tell stories of waking up and finding huge footprints in the moist soil around their sleeping positions. Footprints that weren't there the night before. The realization that a tiger had circled the camp while everyone was asleep, that it might have attacked but chose not to, was deeply unsettling. It created a sense of vulnerability that no amount of weapons or training could mitigate. And then there were the leopards, smaller than the tigers but possibly more audacious in their interaction with humans. Leopards are adaptable and opportunistic. They learn to live near human settlements, hunting domestic dogs, goats, and other easy prey. For a leopard, an American military camp, with its inevitable leftovers of food and potentially injured or distracted prey, could be seen as a food resource. Leopards are exceptional climbers. They can drag prey weighing almost as much as themselves up into the trees. This ability meant that no camp was really safe. A leopard could literally fall from a tree onto an unsuspecting human. Its rosette spots provided perfect camouflage in the light speckled from the forest. But let's shift our focus to smaller creatures that collectively caused far more casualties than all the large predators combined. Let's talk about the insects of the Vietnamese jungle. If you think mosquitoes are just an annoying nuisance, prepare to reconsider. Vietnam is endemic for malaria, dengue, Japanese encephalitis, and several other mosquito-borne diseases. During the war, there were no effective vaccines for most of these diseases. The anti-malarial tablets available at the time had limited efficacy and unpleasant side effects. Many soldiers, already burdened with heavy equipment and limited supplies, were negligent in taking their preventive medications regularly. The mosquitoes of Vietnam were relentless. They appeared at dawn and dusk in dense clouds. Their humming filled the air until it became a constant background noise. They infiltrated through any opening in uniforms, pricked through thin fabric, and seemed particularly attracted to the sweat and body heat of physically active soldiers. Malaria, in particular, was devastating. The disease begins with flu-like symptoms: fever, headaches, chills. But then it evolves into cyclical episodes of extremely high fever followed by uncontrollable chills. During febrile peaks, body temperatures could rise so high that they caused delirium and hallucinations. Soldiers in the jungle, far from medical care, sometimes had to be physically restrained during these episodes to prevent them from getting hurt. Cerebral malaria, a particularly severe form of the disease, posed very serious risks. Even less severe forms left the men completely incapacitated for days or weeks. The disease also tended to recur. A soldier could be treated, appear recovered, and then suffer another crisis weeks or months later. Dengue, transmitted by Aedes mosquitoes, presented its own set of challenges. Known colloquially as bone-breaking fever due to the intense joint and muscle pain it causes, dengue could leave strong men temporarily debilitated. The most severe forms of the disease had serious complications that required urgent medical attention. But mosquitoes were not the only problem arthropods. Vietnamese jungle leeches have become legendary among veterans. These creatures, which look like segmented worms, inhabit moist vegetation and stagnant waters. They detect vibrations and body heat and can move surprisingly fast toward a potential host. A leech attaches to the skin using a suction cup and then pierces with small teeth, injecting anticoagulants that keep blood flowing freely while feeding. The process is usually painless, meaning soldiers often did not realize they were being attacked until several leeches were already firmly attached or until they noticed blood oozing. During patrols through swampy areas or after crossing streams, it was not uncommon for soldiers to remove their boots and discover leeches trapped between their fingers, around their ankles, in their groins and armpits, basically in any warm, moist area. Removing leeches requires care. Tearing them off abruptly can cause your mouth parts to remain embedded in the skin, leading to infections. The preferred method was to use heat, salt, or insect repellent to make the leech loosen voluntarily. But in the midst of a tense patrol with limited time and scarce resources, many men simply tore them off and dealt with the consequences afterwards. Wounds left by leeches bleed profusely due to anticoagulants and are prone to infection in the hot, humid jungle environment. Some veterans described the extremely uncomfortable feeling of realizing that multiple leeches were feeding on them simultaneously. The combination of disgust and powerlessness to prevent future attacks contributed to the constant psychological wear and tear that the jungle imposed. Let's talk now about scorpions and spiders. Vietnam is home to several species of scorpions, some with significantly painful venom. However, a scorpion bite in the jungle environment posed risks beyond the poison itself. Scorpions are nocturnal and seek shelter during the day in dark and sheltered places. Boots left overnight became favorite refuges. The classic scenario, repeated numerous times during the war, involved a soldier putting on his boot in the morning without properly inspecting it and being stung on the foot or ankle by a resident scorpion. The pain of a scorpion bite is immediate and intense, often described as an electric burning sensation. The venom causes severe local pain, swelling, and sometimes systemic symptoms like nausea, excessive sweating, and increased heart rate. For a soldier who needed to be on the move, a swollen and sore foot due to a scorpion bite was a serious problem. The spiders presented similar threats. Although Vietnam is not home to the most poisonous spiders in the world, it has several species capable of causing significantly painful and troublesome bites. Local tarantulas, while impressive in size, are usually relatively harmless. Their bites are painful but rarely dangerous. More worrisome were smaller spiders, particularly those that make their homes in dark, protected areas. Like scorpions, they took refuge in equipment, backpacks, and clothing. Spider bites could cause severe local reactions that required specialized medical care, procedures difficult to perform properly in field conditions. Now, let me introduce a particular terror that combines elements of various fears: saltwater crocodiles. These reptiles, which can grow up to 7 meters in length and weigh more than 1,000 kilograms, inhabit estuaries, river deltas, and coastal mangroves of Vietnam. They are the largest living reptiles and incredibly efficient ambush predators. Saltwater crocodiles can remain submerged and completely immobile for long periods, with only their eyes and nostrils above the surface of the water. They are capable of sudden bursts of astonishing speed both in water and on land. Its jaws exert one of the most powerful bites in the animal kingdom, capable of crushing bones with ease. For soldiers conducting operations in delta or coastal areas, the threat of crocodiles was very real. The waters were murky, making it impossible to see what might be lurking beneath the surface. A crocodile could be meters away, completely invisible, waiting for the perfect moment to attack. Crocodile attacks are fast and extremely dangerous. The reptile uses its natural strength and hunting techniques developed over millions of years. For a human caught by a large saltwater crocodile, the situation was critical, especially in deep waters and far from immediate help. There were also the dangers posed by lesser-known but no less problematic species. Wild boars, for example, are surprisingly dangerous animals when cornered or protecting young. An adult boar has sharp fangs capable of causing serious injury. They are fast, agile, and aggressive when threatened. Soldiers occasionally encountered wild boars during patrols. If a group of soldiers unexpectedly found themselves between a sow and its young, the result could be a dangerous confrontation with a 100-pound animal. Injuries caused by wild boars required medical care due to the risk of infection. We will also consider birds of prey and other flying creatures. Although rarely directly dangerous, large birds of prey occasionally attacked when they felt threatened. More problematic were bats, which in Vietnam include species that carry rabies. Rabies is almost invariably fatal once symptoms appear, and bat bites often went unnoticed due to the small size of the puncture marks. A soldier could wake up with a bat on his face, instinctively push him away and think nothing more about the incident. Weeks or months later, symptoms of rabies could appear. Rabies is an extremely serious disease. The proper protocol after any bat bite is to immediately seek post-exposure prophylaxis, but in the chaos of war, such precautions were often overlooked or impossible to implement. Let's talk about something that may seem mundane but that caused significant discomfort. Piercing and biting insects. In addition to mosquitoes, the Vietnamese jungle hosts numerous species of biting flies, horseflies, ants, and other insects that bite or otherwise bother humans. Fire ants, which build large colonies on mounds in the ground, aggressively defend their nests. Disturbing an anthill, something easy to do when moving through dense vegetation, results in hundreds of furious ants climbing up their legs and biting simultaneously. Each bite releases a poison that causes an intense burning sensation, hence the name fire ants. Imagine being on a silent patrol, where making noise could reveal your position to the enemy, and suddenly you are being attacked by hundreds of ants. The natural instinct would be to scream, thrash, and try to remove them, but doing so could jeopardize the entire operation. Some soldiers had to endure attacks from ants in silence, quietly plucking them out as they continued their missions. There were also the giant centipedes, which could grow up to 20 centimeters in length. These arthropods have poisonous fangs and a rather painful bite. Like many other creatures we discussed, they sought shelter in equipment and clothing. A centipede inside a boot or backpack could bite defensively when disturbed, causing considerable pain and swelling. The cumulative effect of all these natural threats cannot be underestimated. Each encounter, could seem relatively minor compared to the dangers of armed combat. But collectively, the constant vigilance required, the ever-present fear that something might be hidden in his boot, his tarp, the foliage around him, created a level of psychological stress that was difficult to quantify. Soldiers developed all sorts of protective rituals and superstitions. Some refused to leave their boots on the ground, hanging them on branches every night. Others slept with machetes or knives at hand, not just to defend against human threats, but to quickly cut off or fend off any creature that could investigate them at night. There was development of an almost rational paranoia where every sensation, every tickle in the skin, every perceived movement in peripheral vision, triggered an alert response. This constant hypervigilance is exhaustive. The human body was not designed to maintain such a state of heightened alert indefinitely. The result was chronic fatigue, not just physical but mental and emotional. Let us also consider the role that tropical diseases, in addition to those transmitted by insects, have played. Dysentery, caused by parasites or bacteria in contaminated water and food, was endemic. Imagine trying to maintain effectiveness as a soldier when your digestive system is compromised, when you are losing fluids faster than you can replenish them, when feeding becomes a constant challenge. Fungal infections thrived at constant humidity. Athlete's foot, fungal infections in the groin and under the armpits, were not only uncomfortable, but could become debilitating. In humid tropical climates, where drying out completely was almost impossible, where socks and boots remained damp for days on end, these conditions became almost inevitable. Prolonged immersion in water also caused maceration of the skin, particularly on the feet. Known as trench foot or immersion foot, this condition results in softened and degraded skin that is extremely vulnerable to infection. In severe cases, the condition could become serious. For infantrymen whose lives depended literally on their ability to march, compromised feet were an existential threat. And we cannot forget the role of rodents. Rats and mice were abundant in areas where humans stored food. They carried fleas that in turn carried diseases. They contaminated food supplies with urine and feces. Their bites could transmit a variety of pathogens. On more permanent bases, rodent control was a constant and often lost battle. There were also water buffaloes, domesticated animals used in Vietnamese agriculture. Although usually docile when handled properly, male water buffaloes can be extremely territorial and aggressive. Weighing up to 800 pounds and equipped with formidable horns, an enraged water buffalo posed a significant danger. Soldiers occasionally encountered these animals in rural areas and, if interpreted as threats by buffalo, could be attacked. Let's return for a moment to the predators and consider not only the direct attacks, but the psychological impact of knowing that you are potentially prey. Humans evolved as hunters, but we also carry deep ancestral memories of times when we were equally prey. In the Vietnamese jungle, this ancient fear was reactivated. Hearing the roar of a tiger in the darkness, even from a distance, elicits a deep instinctive response. It is a sound that our ancestors recognized as significant danger, and this response is encoded in our DNA. Soldiers describe the sensation of their hair literally bristling, their heartbeat racing, adrenaline flooding their systems in response to big cat vocalizations. This primitive fear response was different from the fear of combat. The fear of being attacked by another human is rational and can be mitigated through training, tactics, and proper preparation. The fear related to predators that evolved over millions of years as natural hunters touches on something deeper and much harder to control through reason. Some men have developed what we might now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder specifically related to encounters with wildlife. Recurrent nightmares about snakes, waking up sweating from dreams where tigers chased them, exaggerated startle reactions to small movements or shadows. All these were manifestations of trauma focused not on human combat, but on natural threats. The stigma surrounding admitting such fears was significant. A soldier could gain respect by talking about intense combat situations, but admitting deep concerns about snakes or wildlife was viewed differently. Consequently, much of this psychological challenge remained unrecognized and untreated. We must also consider the adaptations that the soldiers have made. Over time, platoons developed localized knowledge about which areas had the highest concentration of snakes, where crocodiles were most common, which behaviors reduced the risk of encounters with tigers. Experienced soldiers learned to read the jungle, to notice when birds suddenly stopped singing, which could indicate the presence of a large predator, or to recognize patterns in vegetation that suggested the presence of snakes. Some men have developed remarkable identification skills. They could distinguish between poisonous and non-poisonous species of snakes with a quick glance, could recognize footprints and signs of different animals, could predict where they were most likely to encounter leeches or mosquitoes. This unofficial expertise in natural history was a byproduct of necessity, a survival adaptation in a hostile environment. But even with experience and knowledge, the random nature of wildlife encounters meant that no one was completely safe. A 2-year veteran could be stung by a snake simply for putting his hand in the wrong place at the wrong time. Experience reduced risk but did not eliminate it. We will also talk about the impact of the seasons. Vietnam has 2 main seasons, the dry season and the rainy or monsoon season. Each presented its own set of wildlife-related challenges. During the rainy season, mosquito activity increased dramatically. The floodwaters created new habitats for water snakes and crocodiles. The leeches became even more prevalent. The constant rain also made protection against insects more difficult. Insect repellents were washed away by sweat and rain almost as soon as they were applied. Keeping clothes dry was impossible, creating perfect conditions for fungus and skin maceration. During the dry season, different problems emerged. Water sources became scarce, concentrating both humans and wildlife around the remaining water sites. This increased the chances of encounters. Snakes actively sought out wet and cool areas, which often meant proximity to human encampments where water could be stored. The extreme heat of the dry season also affected wildlife in ways that increased danger. Heat-stressed animals are more irritable and more prone to aggressive behavior. Water buffaloes, wild boars, and even wild elephants occasionally encountered became particularly unpredictable during the warmer months. Speaking of elephants, although encounters were rare, they occasionally occurred. Wild Asian elephants inhabit the mountainous and forested areas of Vietnam. An adult elephant has no natural predators and few fears. When provoked or when protecting puppies, elephants can be extremely dangerous. They are large animals and impressive strength, able to move with surprising speed when needed. There have been incidents where military operations have inadvertently disturbed groups of elephants. The resulting chaos, with animals several tons in panic or agitation, was extremely dangerous. Elephants are resilient large animals, and any confrontation posed serious risks to everyone involved. We will also consider the role of diseases that were not directly life-threatening but that severely degraded quality of life and operational effectiveness. Roundworms, tapeworms, hookworms, and other parasites could be contracted through contaminated water, undercooked food, or even through the skin when walking barefoot on contaminated soil. These parasites cause a variety of symptoms: chronic abdominal pain, diarrhea, weight loss, anemia, extreme fatigue. A soldier infested with intestinal parasites could appear healthy externally but be slowly draining nutrition and energy from within. Antiparasitic treatments of the time were only moderately effective and often had significant side effects. Schistosomiasis, caused by parasitic worms that penetrate the skin during contact with contaminated fresh water, was another common disease. The larvae of the parasite swim freely in waters where infected snails live. They penetrate directly through intact skin, often without causing immediate sensations. Once in the body, they migrate to the blood vessels around the intestines or bladder, where they mature and begin to produce eggs. Acute symptoms include rashes, fever, and muscle pain. Chronic infections can cause severe damage to organs, including the liver and bladder. Treatment requires specific medications that were not always available in the field. Many soldiers returned home carrying chronic parasitic infections that continued to affect their health for years. Think of the irony. A young man survives intense fighting, avoids being killed by enemy weaponry, only to return home chronically ill due to microscopic organisms contracted in seemingly innocuous waters. This was a reality for thousands of veterans. Now, let me take you to an often overlooked aspect: the cumulative psychological impact of living in constant proximity to natural hazards. While humans have remarkable adaptability, there is a limit to how much constant stress the psyche can withstand. Soldiers faced not only a unique and identifiable threat, but also an intertwined complex of dangers. Enemy ambushes, landmines, traps, artillery, and simultaneously poisonous snakes, disease-carrying mosquitoes, large predators, parasites, piercing insects, and countless other natural hazards. The cognitive burden of maintaining constant vigilance against so many different threats was immense. This cognitive overload contributed to decision fatigue. When every action, from where to step to where to sit to what to touch, required careful evaluation of multiple potential risks, the ability to make decisions degraded. Exhausted men made mistakes that could have serious consequences. There was also the phenomenon of sensitization versus habituation. Some soldiers have become accustomed to certain threats over time, becoming less reactive and more functional. Others became sensitized, their anxiety responses intensifying with each new encounter. There was no way to predict who would develop what response. Veterans' reports often mention moments of disruption related not to combat, but to natural threats. A man who had maintained composure through multiple shootings could completely fall apart after waking up with a snake in his sleeping bag. Another could function effectively until suffering malaria for the third time, after which his spirit simply broke. The feeling that the environment itself presented constant challenges was difficult to process psychologically. A human enemy could be understood, could be faced through strategies. But the jungle, with its poisonous inhabitants, biters and predators, was ruthless and indifferent, could not be negotiated or controlled. She simply existed. Some men have found ways to make peace with this reality. They adopted a kind of fatalistic acceptance. They would take reasonable precautions, but in addition, they would recognize that much of it was out of their control. This mindset, while not necessarily healthy in the long run, allowed for short-term functioning. Others never managed to accept it. They remained in a state of constant struggle against their environment, spending enormous amounts of mental and emotional energy trying to control the uncontrollable. Let us also consider the social aspect of these environmental challenges. Shared suffering can create intense bonds. Platoons that survived together through not only combat but also the trials of the jungle developed deep connections. Men who removed leeches from each other, who cared for febrile companions with malaria, who stood guard while others suffered from dysentery, formed bonds that lasted for decades. But there was isolation as well. A man suffering with chronic parasitic infection could feel ashamed, believing he was failing his companions by being sick. Someone struggling with fear of snakes could hide this, worried about looking cowardly. This unspoken isolation, this inability to fully share internal struggles, added another layer of difficulty. The military authorities recognized some of these challenges. Basic education on dangerous fauna was provided. Medical supplies included antivenoms for snake bites, anti-malarial medications, treatments for parasitic infections. But resources were limited. Priorities had to be established, and combat threats often took precedence over natural threats in resource planning and allocation. There was also the challenge of logistics. Antivenom requires refrigeration and has a limited shelf life. Maintaining an adequate supply of multiple types of antivenom on remote bases in the jungle was difficult. Insect protection equipment degraded rapidly in severe conditions. Field innovations emerged. Soldiers discovered that female nylon stockings, worn under the boots, provided some protection from leeches. Homemade insect repellents were created by mixing various substances. Improvised methods to create barriers against snakes around sleeping areas were developed. But each solution brought its own problems. Extra socks meant more heat and more moisture, increasing the risk of foot problems. Homemade repellents could cause skin irritation. Barriers against snakes were imperfect and gave a false sense of security. Let's talk about going home. For many veterans, experiences with Vietnamese wildlife have left marks as deep as the combat itself. Men have developed long-lasting phobias. A veteran could live in the American Midwest but panic at the sight of a harmless garden snake. Another might be unable to camp or hike due to intrusive memories of jungle threats. There were also ongoing physical health issues. Chronic parasitic infections could persist for years if not treated properly. Organ damage caused by tropical diseases was sometimes permanent. Veterans dealt with recurrent malaria problems, complications of untreated schistosomiasis, chronic skin conditions initiated by fungal infections in the jungle. The civilian medical system was often not equipped to diagnose or treat these tropical conditions. Doctors who had never seen schistosomiasis or certain forms of malaria could misdiagnose or undertreat. Veterans often had to become their own advocates, educating medical professionals about their conditions. Psychologically, the processing of the jungle experience took place over decades. Some men have never talked about it, keeping their experiences deeply. Others eventually found therapeutic value in sharing their stories. Veteran support groups sometimes found that discussions about wildlife experiences resonated as deeply as discussions about combat. There was also an element of pride. These men had survived something extraordinary. They had faced not only a human enemy but also the harshest challenges that nature could present. They had discovered reserves of resistance and resilience they did not know they possessed. This perspective, while not erasing the trauma, provided some measure of meaning. As we move towards the end of this journey through the Vietnamese jungle, it is important to recognize that the stories I shared represent real experiences of real people. Every statistic about snake bites, every report of malaria, every description of an encounter with a tiger reflects genuine human suffering and courage. The young men sent to Vietnam did not expect to become improvised educators in tropical herpetology. They did not prepare mentally to confront the limits of their psychological resistance against relentless natural threats. They were placed in an extraordinary situation and forced to adapt or perish. Many of these men have returned home transformed in ways that go beyond typical war trauma narratives. They carry memories of an environment that has tested every aspect of their being. Physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. They felt absolute vulnerability. And somehow, most have found ways to continue, day after day, in circumstances that defy the imagination. The lessons of the Vietnamese jungle go beyond the specific historical context. They remind us of our fundamental fragility as a species. We build cities, we create technologies, we develop cultural sophistication that allows us to believe that we transcend nature. But put a human being in a humid tropical jungle, surrounded by predators and parasites, and we quickly remember that we are still animals, vulnerable and small in the face of the vast forces of the natural world. There is humility in this memory. There is also respect for human resilience. Soldiers in the Vietnamese jungle faced conditions that should have broken the human spirit completely. However, most survived. They adapted, endured, and eventually returned. This testimony of the human capacity to endure must not be forgotten. As we close, it is worth reflecting on the fact that while the war in Vietnam ended decades ago, the jungle remains. Tigers still hunt under the canopy of trees. Snakes still glide through the undergrowth. Mosquitoes still buzz in the hot humidity. Nature remains indifferent to the human dramas that unfold within its limits. Perhaps there is something comforting about this continuity. The natural world persists independent of our ambitions, conflicts, and sufferings. He existed long before us and will continue long after. Our task is to find our place within it with humility, respect, and recognition that ultimately we are not separate from nature but deeply entwined with it. The men who faced the Vietnamese jungle learned this truth as hard as possible. Their experiences offer us valuable glimpses, if we are willing to listen, about the relationship between humanity and nature, about the limits of human resilience, and about the importance of respecting the forces we cannot control. May their stories not be forgotten. May your suffering be honored. And may the lessons learned through so much difficulty inform our understanding of ourselves and our place in the natural world. The Lord God, we thank for the protection given to so many who faced these terrible challenges, for the strength given in times of greatest weakness, and for the mercy that allowed many to return to their families. May the memories of these events always remind us of the fragility of life and the importance of each precious moment that is granted to us in this world.